Welcome everybody to this Claim the Future event. As always, some of our speakers are having technical problems with regard to the internet, and I say again, whatever happened to that person who thought about free broadband for everybody across the whole of the country? Anyway, welcome. This discussion is about bringing real power to people. Many of you will know there's a real constitutional debate going on at the moment, both in terms of, yes, the future of Scotland, what's happening in Wales and the future of Wales and Northern Ireland and the border there, but also as a result, I suppose, because of COVID bringing to the fore and exacerbating the whole debate around regional inequality and the lack of power, lack of say of local government leaders in England in policy making by central government as well, is brought to the fore this whole discussion about the future constitutional arrangements for our country, the structures that we need, and I think the general flow as well about power back to the people at the local level. My own view, I think there's a paradigm shift going on at the moment in the way we saw a paradigm shift after the Second World War and the way we saw it late 70s, early 80s. I think there's another paradigm shift going on at the moment as well. And it is about people wanting to have a real say about their futures, but it is based upon actually about a sense of community as well. So we've organized 3 sessions on the Claim the Future project around this issue about constitutional change. We've invited a number of speakers. All of our meetings, like all our events like this, are pretty informal. And we invite panels of speakers just to give us their views from their different perspectives and their different experiences. But then also we invite people to put comments in the chat and questions that we can put to the panel. And that then feeds into the other discussions that will take place over these 3 sessions, as I say. We want to cover quite a lot of ground, and we've got a limited period of time to do that. But as I say, when stuff goes into the chat, we'll respond to that as best we can. And other sessions will be organised. Areas we want to cover today is Scotland, what's happening in Scotland, the debate that's going on. Actually, it's just been absolutely enlivened as well with regard to now the election of a new Labour leader too. What's happening in terms of local government outside of London in particular, regional local government, what's happening in the cities and the regions outside of London, the southeast. Also, what's happening in terms of Wales and the debates and the discussions that are going on there. I think this is potentially a huge period of change in the way that democratic decisions are made, the way that people engage in decision making, and the way actually people are demanding rights and resources. So let's have a see how this panel discussion goes. As I say, if you've got any questions or ideas, put them into the chat and we'll try and respond to that. If not in this panel discussion, certainly in the ones that come up in the next few sessions. Okay. Our first speaker is Neil Findlay. Neil is an MSP. He's been involved in the debate around constitutional change in Scotland for a long period. He's had a fairly strong voice about the sort of issues that need to be dealt with, coming from very much a class perspective. And obviously with the election of the new Scottish leader going on at the moment, Neil will be a voice in that debate as well. It's interesting because it's interesting how changes in Scotland, Wales and elsewhere is also opening up the whole debate about our constitutional arrangements. I think it's a really healthy debate that we need to have. Over to you, Neil.
Okay, thanks very much, John, and good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. Tony Benn, the great man, once set out 5 questions of democracy and urged all of us to ask them of those in power. If we recap, they were: what power have you got? Where did you get it from? In whose interest do you use it? To whom are you accountable? And how do we get rid of you? I have unashamedly plagiarised the great man's style, but this time urged people to ask 4 fundamental questions on the future of Scotland. But you can equally apply that to your region or your nation? So my 4 questions are this: what type of country do we want to create? What powers do we need to create it? Where should those powers lie? And how do we deliver them? So as I speak, please keep those questions in mind and consider them, and I will try and answer them myself as we go. If we survey the political and constitutional landscape of the UK, we see a confusing hodgepodge of district councils, parish councils, unitary authorities, boroughs, national and London assemblies and parliaments, metro mayors, police and crime commissioners, the House of Lords, the House of Commons, and God knows what else. The COVID crisis has exposed the often competing and incoherent ways in which these different bodies and their political leaderships interact and work. And who can forget the incredulity on the face of the Greater Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham as he gave a press conference about negotiations with the government on lockdown support for his region, only for an aide to then show him a mobile phone message of what the government was going to impose on the region that he is supposed to be accountable for. That's no way to run a country in the 21st century, in my opinion. And COVID and Brexit have further exposed the crisis in capitalism, but also the crisis in our local democracy and decision-making. I think there's a palpable feeling across the country that decisions must be made more local and definitely more accountable. Our towns and cities and regions and nations all have their own distinct culture and identity. Regional foods and accents and words and customs and art and humour and music are what makes our different communities unique, lively and vibrant. And we're rightly proud of them and protective of them. And we have a connection and affection for their history and their landscape and their idiosyncrasies. In so many ways, it's amazing these national and regional differences survive in spite of the consumer society that seeks to homogenise our culture and not because of it. And it's only because of human resilience and a driving desire for justice and the organisational abilities and determination of different communities of people that the grotesque failings of capitalism are resisted and at times rebuffed, and that our identity is protected and celebrated. So this brings me to the first question I set: what type of society is it we want to create? Well, if we look at COVID and the banking crisis before it across the world, even the most right-wing of governments have been forced to accept that market economics cannot answer the biggest questions posed since World War II. What would have happened if there had been no state intervention across the UK to shore up the financial system or the banking system and keep people fed and their wages paid during COVID? Unemployment would be in the tens of millions. Many more families would have been left destitute. More businesses would have closed in every sector. Workers would have been left unpaid. And in such circumstances, it would have been a real threat to the complete breakdown of society and law and order as desperate, abandoned people tried to survive. The reality is that the government was forced to adopt policies that run completely contrary to their political philosophy, and massive state intervention was forced upon the Tories to shore up the economy, paying wages of workers to stay at home, sector after sector receiving taxpayer money pumped in, where previously they would have been left to go under. We all remember the 1980s. Projects were funded to feed the hungry, computers bought to help educate children at home, and subsidies paid to transport operators to run empty buses and trains. The reality is that the government was forced to take that interventionist approach to deal with the crisis. But my question is, or therefore begs the question, if we can adopt such an approach where the state steps in to support those in real need at a time of crisis, why can't we do this in normal times to create the better society? I want to see a society of full employment where no one goes hungry, where every child has the same opportunity to learn and flourish, where public services are funded and supported to meet community needs and controlled and owned democratically, and where we protect our environment for future generations. One where political power and decision-making is returned to local communities, with councils re-empowered and funded and given constitutional certainty, their position given constitutional certainty, and no longer just seen as an administrative layer to take the blame for cuts handed down from above. I want a planned and regulated economy where human endeavour is applied to meet society's needs, not to pursue the holy grail of wealth accumulation. So that's the type of society that I want to see in the answer to question 1. But question 2 and 3, what powers do we need to create it, and what level should these powers lie? Now, I operate on the basic principle on which all powers should be devolved to the lowest possible level unless there is a logical, beneficial and overwhelming reason not to devolve them. So let me take 2 examples to explain. First of all, on drugs. Scotland, to our national shame, has the worst rate of drug deaths in the world, 3 times worse than in England, worse even than the United States. It's therefore, to me, logical that all policy related to drugs be fully devolved to Scotland to address the crisis we have here and to prevent the Scottish Government having any excuse to point the finger elsewhere. Why would we not do this? Scotland and Wales and Merseyside and London and every other English region should equally be able to develop policies to meet their local needs, pressures and circumstances. We can then hold the government and public bodies to account for their decision making and measure the success or failure of policy without them having any excuses or other bodies to point the finger at. Let's look at another area, the border. We live in a small island nation with a well-developed internal market, free movement of goods and people within our countries. No one with any sense is arguing that this should end, but we need to ensure that we maintain and develop the highest possible standards in areas such as food production, employment rights, consumer protection, and on environmental standards. So I would argue that it makes no sense to erect internal borders between the regions and nations of this island, and that control of the border remains reserved at a UK level, but that we have the flexibility necessary within that arrangement to meet our own specific national and regional needs, including over immigration policy. If Scotland were independent and returned to the EU, as is the SNP's stated policy, then there would be a hard border between Scotland and England, as Scotland would be in the EU and the rest of the UK outside. These are just 2 examples of where I think we can make decisions based on what is best for the country about where those powers lie. And then we would systematically work through all the powers and see where the natural level of government for each power is to rest. There will be debates and there will be disagreement about a minority of powers and where they should lie, but that can be resolved through negotiation. And finally, how do we deliver those powers? Well, I've long argued that a third option in Scotland in any future constitutional referendum is the way to go. A third option that is not the status quo, a third option that is not independence. And that option should be based on the maximum practical and beneficial devolution of powers to the most appropriate level. Subsidiarity, it used to be called, and it's an option that is not a fudge or a cop-out. It's the most logical and beneficial proposal for the long-term economic, social and political well-being of the country, with the potential to transform Scotland and I think transform the UK. I hear some argue that a multi-option referendum is impractical and that it's just a ruse to prevent independence. And I hear others argue that it's a cop-out to nationalism and would divide the anti-independence vote. Indeed, those claims typify the debate that is going on in Scotland, because at the moment we have 2 sides entrenched in their position, lobbing boulders at each other, and quite happy to do so because it suits the SNP and it also suits the Tories to continue with that polarised debate. Multi-option referendums have been used across the world on over 100 occasions, and we could use it in Scotland to decide the national question, and I think we may be able to use them across the UK as well. So I've now answered my 4 questions, and I'd like you to consider them in respect of your nation or region and answer them too, and then think about how we build a broad and progressive movement for democratic change across the UK. One where we retain UK-wide redistribution, where we maintain a united labour and trade union movement, and where my cousins in Liverpool and my friends in Newcastle, London and Cardiff enjoy the benefits of what I would argue should be radical socialist change and democratic renewal. In the 1990s, some nationalists and socialists were able to set aside their differences and come together in a campaign called Scotland United, which proposed a multi-option referendum, and that pressure built to eventually deliver the Scottish Parliament. It's my belief that this is what is required now, not just in Scotland, but at a UK level. So I hope from this initiative today that we build a broad coalition and a properly resourced campaign to change our economy and change our democracy for the better. Finally, can I say one thing? Sean Griffin was employed by the Labour Party to do a major piece of work on the Constitution under Jeremy Corbyn. It is a terrific piece of work that he has done on radical federalism, which, for reasons I won't go into, it appears not to have seen the light of day. We have to get that document out to people because it is the most thorough piece of work done from a Labour point of view on constitutional change for decades, and we should get that out there, debate it and build upon it. Thanks very much for the invite to speak, and I'll be interested in the discussion going forward.
Hi, thanks very much, Neil. That was excellent, and I'm sorry I'm a late arrival at this event. All sorts of technical glitches, which means I've missed the introduction. So I will find out what you actually know about this event later on, but I assume that John will have told you about Claim the Future. In terms of the red paper, I'm a convener of it, and Neil is a very, very valuable member of the Red Paper Collective. We've worked for 10 years to try and explore the different options that exist along the spectrum between independence and status quo. And his contribution there, I think, has given us a really good introduction to those ideas. But I hope that people who are interested will continue to explore them, and later in this event. I wasn't sure either whether Neil was introduced at that point, but it's very sad to say that Neil will be standing down as a member of the Scottish Parliament in May, but he is working incredibly hard still to try and ensure that Labour goes into that election with a good policy, not just on all the issues that affect everybody, but those relating to the future of Scotland. I'd like then to introduce Jamie Driscoll. Jamie is the elected mayor of north of Tyne Authority. Jamie, a bit like Neil actually, left school at 16 and returned to education as a mature student. He's been a councillor for in Newcastle City Council before being elected as mayor. He won that election promising to put socialist policies into practice. He's committed to driving forward his manifesto pledges around community wealth building, the climate emergency, revitalising local communities, building affordable homes, and delivering lifelong learning. I think we've got a great mayor here, and I hope that he's going to draw the links between what's going on in Newcastle and what's going on in the rest of the country. So over to you, Jamie.
Thanks, Pauline. And yeah, it's always good to be reminded of your manifesto commitments on a regular basis. I'll start with telling you a little story, actually. I've got two sons. My eldest son, when he was 9, his name's Leon. We were doing some maths question at home, and he just looked up from his book and he said, Dad, I've got a problem with this question. and it was from an American maths book. And the question says, Catherine owns a diner. She earns 400,000 each year before taxes. The federal income tax, the state income tax, property taxes, licenses, payroll taxes take 2/5 of her money. How much of her money does she pay the government each year? And I was quite surprised. Really, it's just a simple percentage question. He's very good at maths, is Leo. And he looked at me and says, no, Dad, she's earning £400,000 a year and she's objecting to paying taxes. If there were no tax, there'd be no road coming to her diner. She wouldn't have any customers. She wouldn't get any deliveries, and there'd be no police to stop her getting robbed. And I thought that was brilliant. You know, sometimes it's the emperor's new clothes, isn't it? That it takes a youngster to be able to see through this very proud father moment. And that speaks to, you know, that famous quote from Martin Luther King: before you finish your breakfast, you will have depended upon half the world. And what he was talking about, Martin Luther King, was the interconnectedness of production. It's intricately connected through time across professions, as my son Leon realised. None of us ever produces anything without the help of others. So when we hear right-wing ideologues claiming that the government is taking their money, or like in the past, Margaret Thatcher prattling that the problem with socialism is eventually run out of other people's money, it was never their money in the first place. Just like that diner, the only way anyone makes any money is in conjunction with other people, most of whom they've never met. So Martin Luther King wasn't exaggerating when he said half the world. You know, so even making a cup of coffee, well, who built the ship? Who built the lorry? Who, you have to heat the water. Who right now is looking after the electricity station? Who's the primary teacher who taught the midwife to read, who grew up to deliver the engineer who designed the power station? We are a social economy. And once you trace the whole cumulative effort that goes into even the simplest act of production, you quickly realize that anyone who makes a profit at anything only does so by the implicit cooperation of everyone else. So when we talk about the state, we have to do it with an economic analysis, that we look at the state. People are talking about a post-COVID world and getting back to normal. Normal is getting dressed in clothes that you buy for work and driving through traffic in a car that you're still paying for in order to get the job you need to pay for the clothes in the car and the house that you leave vacant all day so you can afford to live in it. And that normal has never been challenged by any government in my entire lifetime. And I'm not that young anymore. Yet we live in a democracy. And representative democracy, though, is limited at the moment to the political sphere and in no serious way encroaches on the economic sphere. Whole swathes of essential services and utilities are governed not by us as citizens, but by the needs of distant shareholders, often based in tax havens. In Newcastle, Philip Alston, who was the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Poverty, visited Newcastle. He says, abandoning people to the private market in relation to a service that affects every dimension of their basic well-being is incompatible with human rights requirements. Democracy has to be economic democracy, and it's a simple idea. It means that the people who do the work get paid for the work, and the profits get reinvested, not extracted for financial bubbles like share buybacks. So that means more local businesses, a level playing field for small businesses, more cooperatives and worker-owned businesses, an active role for workers in the management of a company through the role of trade unions. That also means repealing Britain's anti-democratic trade union laws, all of them, not just the 2016 Trade Union Act. It means bringing our public services back into public ownership, democratic ownership, where workers and service users get to shape them. No more of the you meet the new boss, same as the old boss. It means ending tax dodging. So the role of the state has to be about economic democracy. Then there's the question of devolution and the spatial imbalance of power and wealth. I'm often asked about PR and things like that, and my answer is always, yeah, but PR for what? If it's just going to be about somebody different getting the same powers, that's not enough. In fact, when I was in Glasgow doing a Talk Socialism event a couple of years back now, I was talking to someone who was a bit of a Scots nat, and they were saying, oh, but you don't get it. You don't get that Westminster controls us. And so what are you talking about? I live in Newcastle. At least you have devolution. We have nothing. And it is about that financial power. But Neil was right. You know, Neil was talking about the social and the cultural differences and elements and the richness that we want to preserve. You know, the Labour Party in Scotland can't be a branch office. English devolution is proceeding in baby steps. We have metro mayors now, I think 4 years, I think we're at now, for places like Manchester, Liverpool, good friends Steve and Andy there, and other mayors. Less than 2 years for me. And we have seen some things. We've pushed back on furlough and the tier support. And we have actually, just through soft power and arguing, changed things. But we're wholly underpowered. Post-COVID, we're trying to bail out a failed neoliberal economy. It's like bailing out the Titanic with a teaspoon. Even with the limited powers we've got, I've created nearly 3,000 jobs, safeguarded another 1,700. I've got a good work pledge that guarantees that everybody gets at least the real living wage, not the minimum wage, secure contracts, all of these things working through procurement, and any private employer who signs up for this has to have the same standards, including trade union recognition agreements. But if we're talking about levelling up, because there is a spatial element to the redistribution of power and wealth. The GDP per capita in Newcastle, in the northeast actually, 100 years ago, we were at 93% of national GDP. And in the 1980s, the start of the 1980s, we're at 93% of the national GDP. And then it went down through the Thatcher years. And it continued to go down through the New Labour years, and then down again through the coalition years. And now we get 73% per capita of GDP. We've got life expectancy actually going backwards, pre-COVID, falling. So if we're going to change it, it's not just the political power. It's got to be wealth generating powers that we can develop into a democratic economy. Because after COVID, we've still got a climate crisis. We are not on target across the world for dealing with that. Even if we hit the Paris, great, Joe Biden's there instead of Donald Trump. Even if we hit the Paris climate targets, we're still going to see about 3.2 degrees of warming across the world, which will displace well over 1 billion people and see a collapse of the world economy, much worse than COVID, never mind the human suffering that goes with that. The answers to this is we need a Green New Deal, and that requires a radical intervention in the economy. One of the things that we've been doing, I've been investing with the limited powers that I have with the Green New Deal and making a difference on that. But I'm in the middle of negotiating with central government for a new Devo deal on a slightly wider footprint. And that includes powers like a regional wealth fund, borrowing to be able to invest directly in the economy to make a difference, so that you can say, well, yeah, all right, but you want investment, you've got to hit these social targets, these environmental targets, these workers' rights targets. And the state no longer pushing money at private enterprise, but working and saying, look, state intervention means democratic influence. And we're basing that deal on zero carbon, zero poverty. And everything Neil says about subsidiarity is absolutely correct. So even the Metro Mayor model is what we've got. There are probably many better models, but in the time frame we've got, let's just go with that, because at least it's getting some power and some control into the regions. But I think we need to be, as I am, I mean, I have trade unions on representing every board that I set up, and working with communities, pushing power down. Our community hubs are actually being co-designed in direct partnership with communities, and the Poverty Truth Commission we're doing on the same basis. But the first thing is to put economic democracy on the agenda. So little of this is ever addressed in public discourse. We argue about personalities, we judge media performances. The media will say Boris is good because he's used a 3-word slogan, or hang on, he's bad because he's done a U-turn. The real power of money goes unquestioned. And we're going to expect the guardians of the status quo to object to any debate that seriously threatens their power. Held a camera, the Brazilian Archbishop, he says, when I gave food to the poor, they called me a saint. When I asked why the poor have no food, they called me a communist. So this means standing strong. It means basing your policies on analysis and not on 24-hour news headlines. It means taking on the arguments and winning them and not dodging. It means being a signpost and not a weathercock. And it means rejecting that this is about managerialism, and the Labour Party has to set out an alternative vision from the Tories, because it means remembering that all production is social, and so must all decision making. Cheers.
Excellent, Jamie. That was really inspiring. I mean, I think your description of your area being underpowered, that's how I think many parts of the United Kingdom feel, that the power is somewhere else, and that is being used not to our benefit but detriment. and the aim of achieving economic democracy is something that's really felt strongly, I think, in Scotland, as it's been taken away at this point. But I know we're going to come back to some of the issues you've raised in the questions. We'll move on to Wales now and to Julie Morgan. And from what I can see, Julie, you've been involved in politics, probably in your nappies. You seem to have been involved across Wales and wider. Julie was a social worker. She was assistant director of Barnardo's, and she was elected to represent Cardiff North at Westminster in 1997, wonderfully overturning a Conservative held seat. She served 13 years as an MP before becoming a member of the Senedd, where she's been there for nearly 10 years. Julie is now Deputy Minister for Health and Social Services, but she is attending this session in a personal capacity. So over to you, Julie.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. It's really good to be here, and it's really great to be on a platform, you know, with people from Scotland, the North East, Wales and London, because I think there is now a real impetus to look at the distinctive nations and the regions of the UK, and to see the sort of common threads that unite us, and to look at the distribution of power that exists under the present flawed settlement. As Pauline said, I was an MP for 13 years, and I've now been a member of the Senedd for nearly 10 years. And I was in Parliament when the first Government of Wales Act was passed. Indeed, one of the reasons I went to Westminster was to bring power closer to the people. And that's why I wanted to go to Westminster to get that legislation passed. And in the years before devolution, in Wales, we were used to seeing documents issued from the old Welsh office, which said, for Wales, see England. And documents were exactly the same as those from the Whitehall departments, with just a different signature and with no acknowledgement at all of the different circumstances, the different history, you know, the history of heavy industry in Wales, the different language of Wales, and that was never recognised. So since 1999, that's changed, and we've got a live Parliament, the Senedd in Cardiff, with primary lawmaking powers, making a distinctive mark, broken free to a small extent from the straitjacket of Westminster, with a Labour government there the whole of the period of devolution, working in partnership with the trade unions, in partnership with local government, and able to mitigate to a small extent the years of austerity, those austerity years from Westminster. And we've been able to put policies in place that have been able to have some mitigation. We've had free breakfast for many years, free prescriptions for many years. We were able to change the trade union legislation to a certain extent to mitigate against that. We work very closely with local government, and the whole COVID-19 trauma really has been dealt with by the local government working so closely with the national government in Wales. So we have made some progress, and having, of course, Labour in control all that time. But more and more, we and everybody's recognising that the present settlement is very fragile, and instead of progressing to a more equal partnership of nations and regions, and with more equality with local government, there's a definite rowing back from the centre, and the unitary state will not let go. And of course, one of the glaring examples of this is the Internal Market Bill, passed in December without the consent of the devolved countries. Indeed, the Welsh government has notified the UK government of possible legal action about this legislation. And powers in this bill are so wide and deep that they risk restricting the laws that can be made by the Senedd. For example, under the Act, Wales and Scotland would not have been able to introduce minimum unit pricing for alcohol. And there are other examples where Wales's devolved powers could be limited. For example, making Wales unable to ban the production and sale of hormone-treated beef in Wales, although animal welfare and public health are devolved, and undermining Welsh laws on licensing and regulation of private landlords. Landlords located elsewhere in the UK would be able to operate in Wales outside the Welsh law. And finally, the bill gives the UK powers to fund activities in devolved policy areas. And in theory, this could allow the UK government to fund grammar schools, academies and free schools in Wales, totally contrary to the policies of Labour in Wales, where we are committed to the comprehensive system. Well, another very recent glaring example of the lack of notice taken of Wales and its views is the UK's decision not to remain part of the Erasmus programme following the exit from the European Union. Again, the express wish of the Welsh Government to remain in the Erasmus programme, which it was quite possible for the UK government to join in even after Brexit, but instead it's being replaced by the Turing programme, which is much more concentrated on university students rather than the Erasmus programme in Wales, which opened the door to youth groups and to FE, as well as to the universities. So we feel in Wales that there's no doubt that devolution as it is, the flawed settlement, the bit that we've managed to achieve is under threat. And we all know that Johnson called Scottish devolution a disaster. Last week in Wales, a new group was launched with a paper called We the People, The Case for Radical Federalism, pulled together by the former Welsh Minister and my predecessor in Cardiff North, Sue Essex, backed by the First Minister of Wales, Mark Drakeford. And I am part of that group, supporting their calls for further devolution and decentralisation, echoing a lot really what Neil said earlier on, bringing power even closer to the people and giving local government a more equal status, getting a fair share of resources and decentralising prosperity across the UK, and getting a fair financial settlement based on need, but also recognising the common links and the shared history across the UK, removing patronage and privilege. And I do believe that support for these principles will grow. And I think the proposal that there is a broad movement across the UK working on these principles is something that many of us in Wales would be very attracted to, because I think that there's no doubt the constitutional settlement as it is broken. I am always struck, I always think it's absolutely extraordinary to think of the fact that people are making laws who are members of the House of Lords, who are there because of their aristocratic family, still a small number, but still there, and also the extraordinary that Westminster is unique amongst democratic sovereign parliaments in that it automatically allocates 26 seats for Church of England bishops in the House of Lords, and so I think that those are just glaring examples of how anarchic a constitution that we have. And finally, I'll end, by saying that I think to us who are heavily involved in politics, the constitution is absolutely, is fascinating in a way. But I think we must always link it to what it will actually bring to individual people. And any changes that we make must be done working with people. And I think that is the way that we should progress. And I was, very interested to hear what Jamie said about the way that he was working in the Northeast. So thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you very much, Julie. It's amazing that the common threads we're seeing between the different parts of Britain here. The idea that the common thread, as Judy said, is the distribution of power, or the misdistribution of power, and the idea that the unitary state just will not let go. And that's perhaps why we've got to look at constitutional change. The constitutional settlement, as you say, is broken, then something's got to replace it. We've got one more speaker to go. I'm hoping he's here ready to go. Yes, he is. And that's John McDonnell, as you can see. John has been a local, well, I wouldn't call it local council in terms of the Greater London Council, because it covered such a vast area. But he is now MP for Hayes and Harlington. And he is, along with everything else he does, he is an incredibly dedicated local MP, putting a lot of effort and time into supporting his constituents, not least around the issue of the third runway at Heathrow. But I think John's constituency is a clear reminder to us that there are parts of London that have the same, if not sometimes worse, problems with poverty and deprivation as other cities in the UK. And that gives us that link with those people in London that we shouldn't forget. But I think it's important to say that John will always be known to us as the People's Chancellor. So over to you, John. John, sorry to interrupt. You know what I'm going to say.
I'm mute. Sorry, we're never going to get used to this, are we? Look, Pauline, what I was saying is that when your line dropped out, I was asked to just open the session up, and I, with my usual problem of imperialism, I failed to mention that this wasn't just a session organised by Claim the Future, but it was also in collaboration with the Red Paper Collective and what you've been doing. And I'm hoping when I finish speaking that actually you'll then take us through some of the ideas that you've been working on, that Neil referred to in the report that was produced but not published. And I think I agree with Neil Findlay. I think it's critically important that that report sees the light of day. It was a huge and detailed piece of work, really comprehensive. Let me briefly comment on some of the things that have been said so far, because we're all in the same debate here about bringing power back to the people. And Neil started off with a quote from Tony Benn, and that it reminded me that Ben always made the emphasis that what democracy was all about was about moving power from the wallet to the ballot box. And it was basically saying that power should be exercised not through a market mechanism, but through the voting booth, and then into democratic chambers of elected representatives, exercising that power from the people. And I've been trying to challenge some of the narrative about the centralisation of the British state, because I think the last 40 years or so, in terms of a centralised state in the UK, particularly with regard in relation to the English local government, is almost an aberration, because there's a long tradition in English local government of a decentralised state. In fact, despite English history always being taught about a sort of sequence of kings and queens, actually most decision making was actually made at the local level around issues around security and rights and justice, and even the relief of poverty. And when centralised power was exercised, particularly over taxation, it actually produced revolt after revolt over generations. So there's a long history of centralised power being actually challenged. And in many ways, English local government evolved organically. It represented, exactly as Jamie Driscoll said, it represented the balance of economic power in local communities, but was largely exercised at the local level. And if you get to the history in the 19th century, what emerged then was, yes, of course, central government departments and a professional civil service. Yes, that was. But central government was still pretty restricted to its responsibilities for security, defence and taxation. But largely government in England in particular was administered at the local level. And as a result of the industrialising economy, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, it was the local response to that Industrial Revolution that made, I suppose, local administration come into its own. And you saw the rise of municipal power. And people forget just how powerful that was, and those structures that evolved, which first of all started with, sanitation and housing, education, energy, the production of energy and distribution of energy, and then inevitably into the development of health provision and continuation of the relief of poverty with local poor law boards. And if you memory of people like Chamberlain in Birmingham and elsewhere, and Herbert Morrison in terms of London County Council, seems to have been eradicated in the recent period. It was largely, I accept, it was largely based upon cities and towns, but it was quite immense. It was a huge, immense network of local power. If you look at just my own experience here, I worked in local government for 20 years, and I was also a GLC councillor, as you said, Pauline. I was chair of finance. But if you look at the history of the London County Council that evolved into the Greater London Council, the range of its powers and responsibilities are housing, education, transportation, public safety, particularly with regard to health, environment, and yes, elements of the economy as well. And those structures had quite extensive discretionary powers to intervene in their local areas as well. And I have to say as well, often large-scale financial autonomy. When I was the chair of finance on the GLC in the early 1980s, I look back on it now, you think about it, it's almost a dream-like halcyon days. We had control of the rates, we had control of business rates, and we were able to borrow directly from the City of London. We had to pass a money bill through Parliament with government permission, but often actually that was not usually a problem. And the capital spend, if you look up the capital spend that was undertaken by local government at that stage, the scale of ambition was enormous across a whole range of public services. And the projects that were delivered were, looking back on it, phenomenal, really. When I was the Shadow Chancellor, I used to do meetings in the City of London. And sometimes someone would have a pop and have a question your ability to be able to manage the economy overall. And I used to remind them, actually, especially if we were in a meeting located in the city, I used to say to them basically, the GLC built the Thames Barrier. I was the last chair of the GLC that made sure it got the resources to do that. And if it hadn't been for me in the GLC, we would be swimming rather than sitting around a desk having this meeting. So interest in the scale of ambition in local government then was balanced by the antipathy of central government. And on Jamie Driscoll's point, the reason the GLC was abolished was because it was started exercising considerable economic power in the redistribution of wealth across the capital city itself, but also because it was developing an economic plan and proposals and intervening through a Greater London Enterprise Board, almost like a National Investment Bank proposal in the London economy. And it was challenging the distribution of wealth and power at that local level in the economy as well, and in sectors of the economy too. So you can understand why Margaret Thatcher abolished this, because not only did we challenge everything that she stood for in terms of the monetary policies she was introducing, but it was much more fundamental than that. It was actually about the redistribution of wealth and power at the local level, using local government structures to do that. From the mid-1980s onwards, and this is why I say for the last 40 years, it's been like an aberration. From the mid-1940s onwards, we've seen the deconstruction of local government effectively, stripped of resources, stripped of the ability to raise resources relatively independently, stripped of powers, restrained, restricted, but then also forced to shift services into the private sector as well by originally competitive tendering, then PFIs, PPPs, and direct privatisation. What I was obviously anxious about is that actually many of the powers in terms of local government, English local government, were not returned under New Labour, because I think there was a suspicion in New Labour circles of, if it did, would the left take over again local government? And I think there was an ongoing suspicion about that. That's why when the Greater London Authority and the mayoral structure was introduced under New Labour, why there was the powers of the mayor and the GLA were so, I think, quite severely restricted. So my conclusion is actually the last 40 years has actually been an aberration in the history of decentralised power in England in particular. And the last 40 years has attempted to undermine that history. But it's interesting, the result has produced quite a considerable backlash, and the result has been actually as a result of the undermining of local democracy, the undermining of local powers. It's enabled a centralised state to impose austerity, particularly over this last 10 years, almost unfettered. And that power directed from the centre has produced, well, as Jamie has indicated, and I think others will reflect upon it, grotesque levels of inequality, regional imbalances of investment and of resources, instances in some areas of a government encouraging managed decline. And we saw that from the 80s onwards. We saw it in cities like Liverpool in particular. And in an unequal distribution of resources, to be frank, has been an absolute disgrace. And it's had its consequences in levels of deprivation and poverty and the way in which regional economies floundered for a long period of time. With COVID coming along, I think it's exacerbated and exposed that even further. And it isn't just about resource inequality, it's about centralised decision making under COVID. And you saw the way in which Andy Burnham and others have stood up and argued the case for their regions for resources, but also exposed just how little consultation and dialogue there's been between central government and local government in terms of how we tackle the COVID crisis. Except responsibilities laid upon local councils and local government structures without the resources or without even any say about what resources are needed and how they should be distributed. I think COVID has done that, but also there's an increasing awakening as well that we're facing an existential crisis in climate change, and the structures of government are incapable of dealing with that unless it relies upon local action, local planning, local decision making. So I think what's happened now, after 10 years of austerity, after COVID hitting us, and now with the existential threat of climate change, there's a natural demand that we have structures that reflect the needs of our communities and can respond to the needs of those communities. And that is about learning from the past exercises as well of how you establish these structures. I was involved in some of the discussions over 30 years ago about regional structures of government, and we need to learn the lessons from that exercise itself, in which is regional structures can't be imposed successfully. They have to go with the regional or local flow. They have to be exactly organic is the expression, and I agree. Any structures that are established have to have a purpose. It can't be just seen as another tier of bureaucracy. And they have to have real power, both power to plan and decide, but also real resources to enable that to happen. And it is now, more than ever, I think, it is about the power to intervene in the local economies, to ensure there is a redistribution of wealth and power, but also so that we harness those economies to tackle the climate change threat that we face. The discussions that are taking place now, I think, are fundamentally important to the future of all our countries, both in terms of Scotland, Wales, England, and also obviously Northern Ireland as well. But let's talk about, from my own perspective, in terms of English local government, what's needed. I think we need to plant the flag of debate and stimulate that debate now, and I think that's beginning to happen. My own view is exactly as others discussed about the need for a convention, a constitutional convention, to look at all these issues, I think is absolutely key. Of course, about federal structures in England and a radical federalism, which involves Scotland and Wales. But I think coming from an English perspective, it is about making sure that actually there's local and regional conventions, and we've argued about linking that to citizens' assemblies so that we can discuss what local challenges and what local issues we face and what are the appropriate structures, and not necessarily the same structures in each area. Why have one monolithic type structure that we want to develop? Why not let it grow organically so it can be more effective and rooted and sustainable? There's lots of discussions about what happens should there be an English Parliament. My view is no, but we've already got the system of English votes for English laws evil at the moment. It needs an element of reform, but on that basis, you wouldn't need an English Parliament. Finally, let me just say this as well. One of the discussions that we had was not just about making sure that there's organic structures developed at the local and regional level to deal with local issues, but also you do have to break the distribution of the central government institutions at the same time. And that means disaggregating them in the local areas so that they're more connected with local decision making. That's one of the ideas we put forward, was making sure that we located elements of the Treasury, the Bank of England, the National Investment Bank that would be developed so that you can enable synergy, linking up with local decision making. They become more aware and engaged in local issues and challenges, and actually more responsive as well as more coordinated. Finally, let me just say that I think there is a paradigm change going on. I actually think as a result of the experience of austerity and COVID now, people are thinking about the future in a different way. And part of that is about how people should have the right to basic services, the right to a decent job, right to a minimum income, right to a decent roof over your head, right to education and training, right to ensure that nobody lives in poverty in that way, a decent environment, but also changing how we value things, not just about the market, but about social value. I think one element of the paradigm change as well is that it is now based upon a sense of community rather than some vague notions of nation states. It's more about what that means in terms of how you live with one another in a local community. And in that way, I think there's a potential for radical democratic reform. But there's a sense of urgency as well as a result of the challenges that we face. And all the speakers have made it absolutely clear, the one that we now face after COVID, that's hitting us rapidly now, that we need to get a real shift on, is climate change. So this is a debate I think that's fundamentally important for the future. Thanks, Pauline.
Thank you, John. Thanks a lot. Yes, I think the point you made about the suspicion, perhaps, of local government, that if you give too much power, it actually means you're giving power away. And I think there is a sort of jealousy around the different levels we have. I hate to say it, even between the Scottish Parliament and local government, it isn't all from Westminster to England. I think we find it in the devolved administrations, a retrenching and a centralising of powers. I think there's some really important issues that hopefully we'll come on to about where we take it from here. Just as John asked me if I would say something about the work that was done on the constitutional issues, under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, he was very quick to identify that something needed to be done in Scotland. It was pretty obvious. And he thought that the idea of doing some substantial piece of work on the Constitution, as Neil referred to, was essential. The Red Paper had been working in this area for since 2011, and we looked at the idea of powers, but touched on something I think John referred to, it's powers for a purpose, not just to demand more and more powers because we thought that would make us more powerful. It was so we could do things with them, and that really is exactly what Jamie's looking at in his area, and Julie in Wales would have gone through all these same arguments. But our concern was that this had to be done on at least a British level, leaving Northern Ireland aside just for the moment because of additional complications to working. And that we hoped under Jeremy that work would start. Unfortunately, just as the report was produced, we hit the 2019 election. It's still there. The work is really valuable. And it's the areas we're going to touch on in the next two debates that we have. On the 21st of February, making about a constitution, and sorry, the 25th of February and the 25th of March, campaigning for progressive federalism. So I hope that you'll be able to join us on those as well, as finding today's session useful. We've had some questions coming in, and I'd like to take some of them. You'll have to bear with me because I'm trying to do all this on my phone, but I'll go back and find. There were a couple of questions that came in on proportional representation, so I'll just combine them. Sorry, there is some disturbance on the line. I don't know. I don't know whether it's been identified, but hopefully it'll go away. Deborah Finn asked, would PR help to neutralise the demand for independence in Scotland, because it would help save Scotland and all of us from being brutalised by a Tory government? And then another question: how can we get serious devolution and badly needed in such a centralised state unless we first get proportional representation? PR works in Scotland? I would put question mark there. Why not in the whole of the UK? So perhaps if anybody feels they particularly want to come in on that. I know, Jamie, you referred to PR in your contribution, and Neil. So Neil, do you want to start?
Yeah, of course, we have PR in Scotland in the Scottish Parliament. Indeed, I wouldn't have been elected if there had not been PR, and indeed you would hardly have a single Labour. I think you would have two Labour MSPs if we didn't have PR, such as the situation we're in Scotland. And PR was agreed by the Constitutional Convention when they discussed the establishment of the Scottish Parliament, and and I think PR in Wales as well. So it would be part of any negotiations. I'm assuming some of the questions refer to PR maybe for the Westminster Parliament as well. I mean, I personally have changed my mind on PR, that I am in favour of a form of PR. Just no one's ever invented the system that I like. So, but the principle is right, that you get representation based on your percentage of votes. But the systems, for me, are all of them are pretty problematic. However, I think it would be definitely very much to the fore of discussions around the decentralisation of the state. I think it would just be inevitable. It would.
If I can come in, if the structure of a federal state, in the discussion so far, lots of people, including yourself, Pauline, and Neil, have made reference to, and Julius mentioned it as well, Parliament needs to be reformed. I think all of us would agree, and Julie made reference to it in terms of the House of Lords. In the 21st century, the fact that we have a House of Lords which is part hereditary still, I find extraordinary, to be honest, that someone sits in the decision-making body of our country on the basis of most probably about 5 generations back, one of their families sleeping with a king or queen at some stage and being then honoured as a result is bizarre. So I think the reform, and also having appointed House of Lords, I find it extraordinary too. So I think the issue around, if we are going to go to a radical federal system and we are having a second chamber, many people, including yourself, Pauline, have proposed that we replace the House of Lords with a Senate, either elected or elected in some form, possibly in terms of nominated via regional structures or national structures. My own view is I'm convinced that actually we do need a second chamber. I was always opposed to a bicameral system, particularly under a House of Lords system. I actually think you must probably do need a second chamber now. So the idea of a Senate, I find really attractive. I am convinced about PR, but I don't think at the moment there is sufficient support for the Commons to be elected by PR. I'd argue for it, but I don't think there is. But there may well be support that if we are having a second chamber, like a Senate, that it actually is elected on a PR basis, but it is done on the basis of ensuring there's a fair distribution amongst the regions and the nations to ensure it's properly reflective. And in that way, having that sort of amending and initiating chamber in that way, I think would give us better representative government overall. So yeah, I've warmed to PR and I support it generally in principle. On Neil's point, it's the system. I just want a system. If it's for the Commons, I want a system which is proportional but also maintains the constituency link. That's the first thing. But actually, if we can't convince people of that, to have a Senate elected on PR based upon a regional and national distribution, I think would be quite important and would really help us break down some of the centralised decision-making that's taking place without knowledge of actually what's going on the ground in individual communities.
Can I just add a little dimension on this? Because I absolutely agree with John. The whole point of this is about good governance. And I agree with Neil absolutely that there is a PR system that works. I just don't know what it is because I've yet to see it. There was a lot of people actually trying to persuade me to run for mayor before I agreed to do it. And one of the things that I did was when I realised that mayors aren't subject to a whip. And the party whip system, I think, is an issue in this and the control of it, because when I can't remember exactly when it was around 2002, 2003, there's a proposal floated by the then Blair government for a reform of the House of Lords, but all the candidates were going to be appointed by a list system. And I thought, oh Christ, this is the last thing we want. And if we're going to have a sense of PR, it's got to be not about putting more power into party whips. I haven't had a chance to look at Neil or Julie's voting records. Actually, in Wales, probably less of an issue. But I know John is famous for the amount of times he rebelled. And good thing too, because if the entire country of one party is voting the same way, then you really don't have any regional representation. So PR, yes, but it's got to increase democracy and not hand power directly to chief whips and party patronage.
Yeah.
Julie, do you want to come in? If you unmute.
I've always supported PR and have campaigned for it. And we do have a form of PR in Wales, you know, because we have the additional list system. And I think it was very good we had that in there when the assembly, as it was then, was created, because otherwise Labour in Wales would have been totally dominant in a way that would not have been healthy. We would have, you know, we would have swept the board on the, if it had all been done by first past the post seats. And my view is that it was better to have an assembly that was more representative of the way that people actually voted. I mean, the fact that Labour has been in control, of course, has been a big advantage. But there is dissatisfaction now with that form of PR, and there are proposals that have not yet been accepted by the Labour Party of moving to possibly multi-member constituencies, which I know that John said we want the constituency link maintained. But does that mean there's just got to be one person representing that constituency link, or could more than one represent it? I think we're, you know, open to all those sort of discussions. But I certainly agree about the Senedd and having regional and national representatives there on a PR system. I think that is would definitely be the way to go with the House of Lords.
Yes, proud to say that today in the House of Lords, I broke the whip and voted against the what is known as the Spy Cops Bill. So there were a big band of Jeremy appointed peers whose job in there is to get it abolished. That's our sole purpose of being there. I have a question, if I could put to Jamie, specifically about your own area, from Peter Morris. Jamie, do you think that North East Combined Authority will reunite with the North of Tyne and do a devolution deal? Do you think it should? We'll let Jamie take that one and then move on to another question.
Thanks, Pauline, and Peter. I don't think I know Peter, actually. I know pretty much everyone in Labour politics in the North East, obviously, apart from Peter. The short answer is we're on with that right now. We all know we need, in fact, shortly after the lockdown, I got my senior economic team together and political team together, and we had a look at what's really the issue here. And you go back decades. The primary issue is there's been a total lack of investment in the North East. And you can't fix that by just having any kind of devolution. It's a mayoral model at the moment for just half of the region. It'd be kind of like having, you know, the mayor of London being the mayor for North London and then the South not being in it. It makes no sense whatsoever. You've got an integrated transport system, or what's left of it, and likewise on a whole range of other things. So we are working on it. There's an issue about timescale, about getting everyone together. But what I've said to central government is, you give us a deal that's heavyweight enough to create the 50,000 jobs and devolve how those jobs are created and what constitutes a good job to me, and we're all up for it, because that then is what we're after. So it is a zero poverty, zero carbon deal that we're going for. Best way to deal with poverty is to get a load of people into well-paid jobs, but there's all sorts of other things peripheral around it. We know that. So that's what we're going for. That's what we're negotiating. Then regional leaders will have to make their decision about how they want to come with us. I strongly hope that they do. And my real hope is that we're so far away from Westminster that the Tories won't really notice what I'm doing.
Pauline, come in on that, because one of the
points
Jamie make elsewhere is important, really, is these deals negotiated, you know, is the only show in town at the moment. under a Tory government. So what's happening is people are to impress upon the central government that actually the only way that we'll deal with this grotesque levels of inequality, climate change, etc., is by making sure the resources flow. Historically, that's never been the case in deal after deal. And what the Tories have been, and I'm sorry, this infuriates me, what the Tories have been good at is landing local government leaders and mayors, elected mayors, with hugely large amounts of rhetoric from central government, massive responsibilities and challenges, and so little by way of resources. Also, any form of independence about how you raise those resources. So the whole discussion, particularly it's across the whole devolution issue anyway, but for me, particularly with regard to English local government, is ensuring that part of the reforms we introduce is in making sure there's an independent taxation base for local government. And one of the issues, and Jamie and I have discussed this, land value taxation is one route forward, in which we make sure that there's when there are developments within a community, largely led by the state, the local state, that everyone shares in the benefits of that by fair taxation system. There's a whole range of other taxation sources, because I don't think local areas or local government or whatever should be dependent on just one main taxation source. There can be a whole range of those, and actually devolving power enables you, local leaders then, local democratic leaders, to determine what is
Well,
you wanted to come in as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I've been watching from afar some of this debate around local government in England, and I think there is from the first sort of principle that we should understand and accept is that just because you devolve something doesn't necessarily make it better. And we've got great evidence of that in Scotland on education, on health, and various other areas where policy has devolved and the outcomes have been much significantly worse. So therefore, there's a danger that people just think that if you devolve power, it's going to be better. The second thing is to say that there has to be caution, and I think the Tory objective is to devolve blame. And if you do not have the resources that comes with the devolution of powers, or if you don't have the ability to raise the resources, then they'll simply devolve blame and point the finger at you for making the cuts. And that's what was seen in Scotland. My own authority that I was a member of before I was elected to Parliament, we had a 450 million budget. In 10 years of council tax freeze and cuts to local government in Scotland, that one authority lost £100 million. That was one small authority. So it is absolutely essential that if local government, in whatever way we see local government, if it's regional government or if it's local government and council, then they have to have, I think, a constitutional right and a constitutional position guaranteed within the constitution of the country of what local government does, and respect for it. Otherwise, you'll just have governments coming in every time and attacking local government, taking powers off them and taking money. My final point is this: local government's the front line of defence against poverty and inequality. It certainly was when I was in local government, a huge amount of work done in that. When I look at England, and I don't know so much about Wales, but I look at that hodgepodge of local government and all the different layers and levels and different organisations. Is there any possibility that we will be able to move on with significant reform that looks like some sort of move towards a federal structure without major local government reform in England? Because what will happen is people will not accept yet another layer of politicians on top of that multiplicity of layers that's there at the moment. So my question probably to Jamie and others is it a case that we need massive local government reform in England to make some sort of federal structure real?
Yeah, thanks, Pauline. Yeah, it's a good question. I think what we've always got to be careful of in these debates is that the perfect doesn't become the enemy of the good. And as John said, it's kind of an only deal in town at the moment. So yes, we do need significant reform, but that reform has to be based on what we need to be much better as a cohesive, the whole of the Labour movement arguing for, and not getting divided into specific one union against another union, all of this sort of stuff, is the basis of economic democracy at all levels throughout it. Some of the things that you've, or I think perhaps someone in the comments was saying, is one of the things we're asking for is land value uplift. Now, I don't think we're going to get it, but I know we've been pushing like hell, and we're going to get a new branch line reopened, Blythe, Ashington, Newcastle, around about 180 million quid's worth of investment. The land around that is going to go up by more than 180 million quid. So the state is generating that wealth, and we're not going to see it. So the reform of local government, then, does it have to be a mayoral model? Is there a case for super-regional bodies like the Northern Powerhouse? Probably. And exactly as you said in your opening speech, then you probably go down these lists and say, well, where would that power best sit? And that's the approach it's got to take. That's a massive approach. In the meantime, it is actually the case of, well, let's get what we can and start to defeat these arguments that local government doesn't know what it's doing by getting as much power as we can, and those powers that we think we can demonstrate well. Because one of the questions I've been asked is, do you want health devolving? And I've looked at it, not been offered it, I've been asked, do you want it? Should we discuss this? And I've looked at it and thought, that's a bit of a minefield. Do I really want to be responsible for implementing Tory cuts? So what we've gone for is things like a regional wealth fund, so that we can start to invest on that basis, and also a power where we a mechanism, which I discussed with John and others about this, where we get the central government departments bound in with a levelling up board chaired by me as the mayor, where we say, all right, this is your policy on education and schools, this is your policy on effort. You have to co-design it with us for what works in our area. And that's where you start to get principles of subsidiarity and soften the edges of the neoliberalism in it. And short of, and we've tried and we will keep trying, and obviously John would have been the Chancellor, initially what was, let's be honest, a fairly social democratic shift in the first instance before you move to something like a socialist economy. Till we get that, then I think it is actually a ratchet is what we're after. Getting as much as we can where we can have socialists demonstrating that this kind of approach is better.
Can I just bring Julian here? Somebody's made the point in the chat that perhaps devolution now is going to be stymied for the future because of legislation such as the UK Internal Market Act. Do you want to make a comment on that if you unmute?
Yes, I did refer to that act, and it is very alarming. It is a big attack on devolution. There have been some modifications that the UK government have brought in, but it does mean that the possibility is there for the UK government being involved in areas that have always been totally devolved, and so it's a very negative move. But that is what we've got with the Tory government. So I think the more that we're able to work in terms across the UK in the sort of way that we've been discussing today, the more likelihood we've got to stop the powers that the Westminster government have now got, to stop them using it. But we do feel in Wales that we are in a very precarious position, because we feel we have been able to achieve things. We feel we have been able to move towards socialism in a modest way, and we see all that being taken away by this, by the Tory government that is rowing back on the unitary state. So I think it is a time when we need all of us, to work together to try to stop this happening.
That brings me to a question that I wanted to ask. Is there a mechanism how we can work together towards constitutional change or even constitutional prevention? Can we explore whether there are ways of bringing Scotland Wales, regions, London, not as a region, but as the bits that really feel like they need more power. I was wondering if there are any suggestions or comments on that. Neil, I can see you.
Yeah, a number of years ago, Pauline, at the Labour Party conference, I had similar discussion with some of the colleagues from Durham, from Gateshead, from Merseyside, London, and I think there is and that was before COVID, and that was before recent developments. You're probably talking about 5 years ago, or 6 years ago, maybe even. And there was a real desire to kind of see if there was an opportunity for us to come together. Now, I can only think that will have strengthened rather than dissipated. So I kind of, I have to say, I'm maybe looking to Jamie in his role as a mayor to see if there is a kind of move with people like Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham and people like that, as well as some of the others, the likes of Julie and Mark Drakeford and others, that we can try and bring this together, and it's something that becomes not just a very good discussion like we've had today, but that actually becomes a drive and a movement towards something much bigger, and that we put pressure on the Labour Party leadership and also the leadership of other parties as well, because I think this is a movement that we would want to see expanded out and get others to. I mean, the Liberals are already saying, they support a federal, UK and all the rest of it. The strength of what happened in Scotland and Wales was that it was cross-party, multi-party, and it became actually probably an inevitability that there had to be change. So I think that someone needs to kind of grab this by the scruff of the neck and see if we can form it into something that is substantial and funded, and where we actually have some capacity in there to develop it as a proper campaign that will deliver. That's been my objective for a long time, but we've kind of soldiered on a wing and a prayer in Scotland with a few quid here and there from friendly trade unions, but really shoestring stuff. Whereas now I think we need this to go to a different level.
Thank you, Julie.
Sorry, I'm not used to unmuting. Yes, well, we've this movement. Well, this group has been set up in Wales, We the People, and the issues we're talking about are the same issues as we've all been talking about today. One of the movers is on your next panel, Nick Antonou. He's coming to that next meeting. So I think what we're thinking of trying to do is to get somebody to do a bit of work to take this forward with more detailed proposals. And we have been thinking of that in the context, particularly of what issues that are faced in Wales. But it would be good to do that in the context of of the whole of the nations and regions, so that we could have the wider grouping, which will be much more influential then in the Labour movement. So I think that there would be definitely people in Wales who would want to be part of something. But I think what we do need is somebody to pull it together and be the link pin.
Thank you. Jamie?
Yeah, well, I think Neil's absolutely spot on. All of these things, they need a secretariat, they need someone to do the work. And as good trade unionists, we all believe that if you're expecting people to do work, you should pay them a decent wage for it. So there is certainly a move for it. I speak with, actually there's a significant move from some of the Tory mayors, because we meet together as the M9. They're now happy with the centralisation than we are. But the Labour Party, I don't think I'm giving away any secrets here. Gordon Brown has been asked to look at the constitutional convention approach. That's going to be happening over the next few months, I think. I don't know whether the timing it to bring it out before the locals. I think there's an element of we have to know when the locals are and have that confirmed. You know, we're talking about attacks on democracy, then the Tories delaying an election in the hope that there's going to be a vaccination campaign finished so they get the benefits of it is not great. So it is there. And I think you're right, Neil. Yeah. So I think, you know, as sort of radical socialists, even just socialists, there is a case for getting a secretariat together so we can get this campaign organised in an effective way and not an ad hoc way, because I'm sure, you know, everybody on the call, we're all elected politicians. You know, we're all working way beyond the working time directive hours already. So we do need other people to be running the campaign.
John?
Sorry, I didn't. You know, I'm going from line to line as things break down here. It's terrible. I love the general view. I think is like steam from a kettle at the moment. This issue is being discussed extensively across different political parties, different civil society organisations. And as we've done today, there's a whole range of ideas about what the solutions are. And I think it's not an idea whose time has come. It's an idea whose time has returned, really. And we're going to have to grasp the nettle soon. I think we have a responsibility now to talk to others about how best this sort of coordinated approach that Neil is suggesting is brought about. And that requires an element of diplomacy that's certainly beyond me, to be honest, but because whoever is asked to do that needs to be someone in whose a wide range of people have an element of confidence and trust. So I think the more we talk to people now, the more the potential will be for a group of people to enable that to happen. On Julie's point, there are so many groups at the moment that are coming together on this issue. So that actually provides us with, I think, quite a considerable resource and an element of enthusiasm that's building. But again, I think we just need to wrap a towel around our heads and think about how that next move forward is brought about. In Scotland, obviously, the Labour Party leadership election is going to have an element of influence on some of the approaches that will take place in Scotland. And with elections coming up in May, almost certainly now, again, that will have its influence. But inevitably, this is coming back on the agenda very, very rapidly. In terms of the Labour Party approaches and the convention approach, anything we can do, it's almost like a thousand flowers bloom. Anything we can do that's to encourage the debate, so much the better. And I'm glad that the Labour Party is now going for that convention approach in terms of discussions. But most probably it will require a number of people coming together from different representative groups to actually say we can create a climate of opinion so that whoever is in government, it becomes inevitable that reform is taking place. I just say don't underestimate, although in local government, in Conservative circles, I agree with Jamie, there's a real amazing discontent amongst Tory local government leaders, particularly as some Tory councils have virtually been on the edge of bankruptcy as well, and they're dissatisfied. But don't underestimate the resistance in the National Conservative Party and then Tory Party in government against any distribution of power outwards from London, the South East, no matter what mouthings are taking place about devolution. I'm afraid that doesn't add up to a row of beans. And secondly, as soon as you put the redistribution of economic power on the agenda, there's bitter and determined resistance. So we need to ensure that we recognise that and build up the public campaigning for change. And I think that's what will turn it at the moment. I agree with Neil, we need some form of forum to enable the work to be done. But part of our role as well is making sure that we're campaigning on the ground in communities about this issue, demanding change and demanding power and resources come into their communities.
Thank you very much indeed. We've come to the end of our time today. The thing I would just add on the end of that is that we mustn't let this become the issue of the Tories. I mean, they will reorganisation. They have any number of committees underway looking at constitutional issues. And just because it's a constitutional change doesn't mean it's going to be the right one, because constitutions are not neutral. They actually shape the society and the politics in that society. So I think we've got to really grasp this now. I don't think it can wait. I know Gordon Brown has had long-standing interest in this area. If you go back to his 1975 red paper, whose title we continued, shall we say, what he wrote about nationalism and constitutional change in that was is inspiring to this day. It's a shame he's moved on. His words are still there, though, for us to draw on. I think if Keir Starmer is setting up this body with Gordon Brown as advisor, I don't think we can assume it's going to come to results that will spread power and, as was mentioned, I think by Jamie, economic democracy throughout the regions and nations. I think that won't be his priority, but it's our priority. So I would hope that you will join us again on the 25th of February when we've got James Mitchell, James Mitchell, Paul O'Connell and Adrian Giovanni all speaking around their views on how a radical constitution can be constructed. And the third session is really about taking this forward, where we want people not just to come along to that session, but to become involved in the debate and organising and creating a movement or a moment, I don't mind which, as long as we create something. And that's on campaigning for progressive federalism with Mick Antoniv, as Julie said, from the Welsh Senedd, Mary Foy from Durham, and John McDonnell coming back from with the London perspective. And it will be chaired by Beth Winter. So I look forward to seeing you again at the next session, and to thank very much our speakers for what was really kicking off, I thought, to be a really stimulating debate. It's a shame we couldn't have just extended it over a longer period, but I hope they will actually continue the debate away from here and begin to work together to develop these ideas. So again, thanks a lot, and hopefully see you on the 25th of February.